Let someone else fight over this long, blood-stained sand. It's their neighborhood. They have to maintain it. They have to take care of it.
Do yourself a favor, a small favor. Google the phrase Trump controversies. Wikipedia has 24 pages of content alphabetized, but none of it has inspired the sort of bipartisan condemnation that was brought on by Trump's decision to pull U.S. troops out of northeastern Syria. House members made that clear in a rare bipartisan rebuke. After 4 years of warfare, Kurdish fighters, supported by U.S. Special Forces, helped to defeat much of ISIS. In fact, Kurdish intelligence was critical to a high-risk U.S. Special Forces raid that resulted in the death of ISIS's infamous leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, late last month.
Kurdish officials tell us that they had a mole very close to Baghdadi, someone who would visit him, was trusted by him, and was passing information back to the Kurds right until the very end, and that they were passing that information along to the United States.
Though America's adversary, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, had won back much of his country, success against ISIS was among the rare triumphs for the U.S.-Kurdish alliance. The Kurds lost more than 11,000 soldiers in that fighting. But the partnership was clear. America got an ally willing to do the heavy lifting against ISIS, and the Kurds got the implicit backing of the U.S. military, which kept their rivals at bay. But what about afterwards? With virtually all of ISIS territory regained and thousands of ISIS fighters languishing in jails, President Trump wasn't exactly quiet about America's plans.
We look forward to giving our brave warriors in Syria a warm welcome back home.
Trump tried to withdraw last year, but then Defense Secretary Jim Mattis pushed back hard. Of course, Mattis is gone now, and with impeachment proceedings bearing down and growing pressure from Turkey, Trump made his move. Why does it matter? Well, let's start with Turkey. For the Turks, U.S. leaving was a green light to invade Syria. Ankara has long been worried that their biggest enemy in Syria, the Kurds, would use the territory they've captured to establish an independent Kurdish state, which would then be a source of inspiration and support for Kurdish separatists inside Turkey. Only a U.S. presence in the region has kept Turkey away this long, and so, in the American absence, all bets were off. Next up, Russia. Now remember, Turkey is a NATO ally still. That's the same NATO that was created to contain Soviet aggression. And the reason I bring it up is that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been hanging out in Russia a lot these days, and he and Vladimir Putin are brokering deals of their own. A drawdown of U.S. forces gives Moscow more influence across the region. Third on the list, ISIS. Thousands of ISIS fighters were locked away in Kurdish jails, but as their Kurdish jailers left to fight Turkey and its militias, many of those jailed ISIS fighters are feared to have rejoined the ISIS ranks, breathing new life into the jihadi group. Lastly, America's allies. The decision to ditch the Kurds doesn't inspire confidence with America's partners, nor does it help convince future U.S. allies that the Americans are to be counted on. Now, for context, the Kurds themselves also know this dance pretty well. Even if they hadn't been listening to Trump's calls for withdrawals, their own history is littered with partners who've had a hard time with commitment. Remember, this is a group that's been searching for a country of their own for almost a century now, promised to them with the end of the Ottoman Empire. But aside from a brief 2-year stretch back in 1922, which the Brits helped quickly put an end to, hasn't happened. The Kurds remain the region's fourth largest ethnic group, predominantly split among 5 countries, all of whom are worried that they might mount a separatist challenge within their own borders, and so the Kurds have been left behind, notably by the Americans, almost ever since. Let's start with 1972. The U.S. supported a Kurdish uprising in Iraq, using Iran to funnel weapons into the region. But it all went downhill 3 years later, when Tehran signed a border agreement with Baghdad that cut off arms to the Kurds. The United States, for its part, also turned its back, and the Kurds, lacking heavy weaponry, were quickly crushed. They tried again in the 1980s with similar results, only this time it was Saddam Hussein employing his now infamous poison gas. Fast forward to 1991. the U.S.-led Gulf War in Iraq. After kicking Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, President George H.W. Bush again encouraged the Kurds to rise up and establish no-fly zones over north and south of Iraq. But unfortunately for the Kurds, Saddam's helicopter gunships were exempted from those zones, allowing Saddam's choppers to be used to decimate Kurdish rebels, who again lacked the weaponry they needed. And when Kurdish leaders asked the U.S. to intervene, America's leaders had already moved on. 3 decades later, history repeats.